The Operator Log, Episode 17. What we observe. What not to build. Markets that fail structurally. Episode 5 of this podcast defined the markets worth building into: proven demand, high human-to-logic ratio, fragmented incumbents, low technological adoption, no regulatory barrier at the Tier 1 task level. That episode answered the question of where to enter. This episode answers the question of where not to. The pillar shifts back to what we observe. The register is analytical, structural observation about what makes a market fail, grounded in what we see during the selection process rather than what we have experienced inside a build. Some markets attract attention because they appear large, active, and profitable. Activity does not equal efficiency. Scale does not equal opportunity. The most dangerous markets for an autonomous builder are not those that lack demand. They are those that possess a structural resistance to autonomy. That condition has a name: systemic resistance. It is the structural state of a market where legal, social, or creative requirements mandate human intervention, making autonomous operation impossible regardless of how capable the technology becomes. Markets with systemic resistance are not inefficient by accident. They are inefficient by requirement. And the required inefficiency is not a problem to be solved. It is the product itself. Arco's record is defined as much by what we reject as by what we build. This episode explains the rejection criteria. This is the Operator Log. The market selection framework established in Episode 5 targets a specific kind of inefficiency: accidental. Accidental inefficiency is the condition of a market where processes are manual because they have not yet been reconstructed, not because they must be. The coordination tax embedded in those processes is structural debt. An autonomous system eliminates it. The human-to-logic ratio approaches zero as logic progressively assumes the task humans are currently performing. That is the operational arbitrage. That is what Arco builds toward. Required inefficiency is different in kind, not in degree. In a market with required inefficiency, the process must remain manual to satisfy a constraint that code cannot resolve. It is not that no one has tried to reconstruct it. It is that the constraint preventing reconstruction is not a technology problem. It is a regulatory requirement, a subjective judgment standard, or a transaction structure that is unique by nature. The coordination tax in those markets is high, which makes them appear attractive. The floor in the human-to-logic ratio makes them structurally unviable for autonomous design. The human-to-logic ratio is the metric that surfaces this distinction. In a market with accidental inefficiency, the ratio can approach zero as the build matures. The architecture compounds, exception handling expands, and more of the workflow is owned by logic with each passing quarter. In a market with a systemic resistance, the ratio has a minimum value that the architecture cannot breach regardless of capability. The floor is set by something external to the technology: a law, a judgment requirement, a transaction structure. It does not move as the technology improves. It is a structural feature of how the market is organized. The test during market selection is simple in principle and requires discipline in practice. Ask whether the human-to-logic ratio has a floor, and if so, what sets it. If the floor is set by the current state of technology, by what agents cannot yet do competently, that floor will move as the technology improves. It is a temporary constraint, not a structural one. If the floor is set by a legal requirement, a subjective judgment standard, or a transaction frequency problem, none of which improve as the technology advances, it is permanent. A permanent floor in the human-to-logic ratio is systemic resistance. When selection reveals it, Arco moves on. The distinction matters because the coordination tax in a systemic resistance market looks identical to the coordination tax in an accidental inefficiency market at the time of evaluation. Both have high human labor costs. Both have slow incumbents. Both have customers who appear frustrated by the current delivery model. The difference is invisible until you ask what the human is actually doing. In an accidental inefficiency market, the human is performing work that deterministic logic could do more cheaply and reliably. In a systemic resistance market, the human is satisfying a constraint that deterministic logic cannot satisfy. Not because logic is insufficiently advanced, but because the constraint is not about logic at all. The human is required because the market is organized around human accountability, human judgment, or human relationship in a way that is structural to how the market functions. An autonomous system placed inside a market with required inefficiency does not capture the operational arbitrage. It becomes a tool that assists the humans who remain. That is a service business. It is not what we build. Systemic resistance manifests in three distinct structural forms. Each permanently disqualifies a market, and each presents differently enough during evaluation that all three must be tested independently. The first form is regulatory. In financial services, legal practice, healthcare, and certain professional services sectors, the law requires a qualified human to sign off on specific units of work, not to govern the framework, to execute the transaction. A licensed attorney must countersign the legal opinion. A credentialed physician must authorize the treatment. A registered advisor must approve the financial recommendation. Agents can assist in preparation, research, and documentation. They can do Tier 1 and much of Tier 2 work. But the final decision is legally tethered to a person's license or professional standing. That creates a flaw in the human-to-logic ratio that the architecture cannot breach regardless of capability, because crossing it would mean violating the regulatory framework. The important nuance here is that not all regulated markets fail this test. Regulation creates systemic resistance only when it mandates human sign-off on each unit of work in the core revenue loop. Many regulated markets have compliance requirements that sit outside the revenue loop itself, reporting obligations, licensing conditions, data handling standards. An agentic system can satisfy those without a human in the critical path. The compliance layer is real, but it is not the transaction. The distinction is whether regulation requires a qualified human to execute each transaction or merely to govern the framework within which the system executes it. The former disqualifies the market. The latter is a constraint that architecture can design around. An autonomous system in a market with regulatory bottlenecks at the transaction level becomes a workflow accelerator rather than an operator. The firm remains a service business with a permanent payroll and a permanent human-to-logic ratio floor. The margin advantage of autonomous design, the structural cost reduction that comes from removing human-in-the-loop dependencies, is unavailable. The coordination tax persists not because of poor design, but because the law requires the coordination to exist. The second form is a subjective judgment. Autonomy requires determinism. For a system to operate independently, the definition of a successful output must be objective and measurable, binary in many cases. The cargo is delivered or it is not. The invoice reconciles or it does not. The data validates or it does not. These are Tier 1 and Tier 2 outcomes. The logic can own them because the correctness of the output is verifiable against defined parameters. Markets that depend on creative intuition, aesthetic preference, or strategic judgment produce outcomes that cannot be defined in deterministic terms. High-end branding, bespoke strategic consulting, original creative production. These are high-margin markets, and they appear attractive by the revenue criteria. They fail the structural test because the variance in acceptable outcomes is irreducible. The definition of success depends on a human evaluating the output against criteria that cannot be fully specified in advance. because the criteria themselves are subjective, contextual, and often emerge from the evaluation rather than preceding it. You cannot encode good taste into a deterministic guardrail. You can encode correctness. Taste is different. In these markets, humans are not an inefficiency. They are the product. Removing the human would be removing the value the customer is paying for. Arco does not build in markets where the outcome is a matter of judgment rather than measurement. We prioritize markets where the outcome is objective, where the logic can own the process because the correctness of its output can be verified against fixed parameters without requiring a human to make an aesthetic or strategic evaluation. The third form is low frequency, high variance demand. A market must have a high volume of repeatable transactions to support an autonomous business architecture. The revenue loop, the sequence of events that generates a transaction, must execute often enough and consistently enough that the architecture can learn, stabilize, and compound. The continuous regression loop that detects logic decay depends on having enough transactions to generate meaningful ghost trial data. The execution divergence threshold depends on enough samples to set calibration parameters. The architecture cannot stabilize on a handful of annual events. Large-scale industrial M&A is the clearest example of the third failure form. Transactions occur infrequently, perhaps a handful per year for any individual firm, and involve non-repeating variables. No two mergers have the same capital structure, regulatory environment, cultural profile, and strategic rationale. There is no standard merger. Every transaction is a unique reconstruction of reality, which means the coordination tax is a permanent structural feature. The human judgment required to navigate each unique situation cannot be replaced by logic calibrated for previous situations, because the previous situations were sufficiently different that their resolution do not transfer. The architecture cannot compound in a market where every transaction is effectively the first. Beyond the three structural forms, there is a fourth pattern that deceives more often than any of them, the false positive. A market that shows high activity, high revenue per player, and visible incumbents whose delivery is slow and expensive, but whose core value proposition is the human relationship itself. These markets present as reconstructable because the surface signals match the criteria from episode 5, high human-to-logic ratio, because the incumbents are human-heavy. Fragmented market because no single player has built a structural moat. Slow delivery because human coordination is slow. But the reason the incumbents have not been displaced by a more efficient operator is not technological lag. It is that the customer is not primarily buying speed or cost efficiency. The customer is buying the relationship, the account manager they have worked with for 8 years, the trust that comes from a named person who knows their business, the comfort of a human available on the phone when something goes wrong. When that is the dynamic, the autonomous model competes on the wrong dimension. It is more efficient than the incumbent. It is not what the customer is paying for. The autonomous business can demonstrate a lower cost per transaction, a faster delivery, and a higher accuracy rate than the incumbent. The customer evaluates all of that and stays with the incumbent, not because the incumbent is better on those measures, but because those are not the measures the customer is using. The test that distinguishes a genuine relationship market from a market where the relationship is an accidental feature of the delivery model is in how customers describe their reason for loyalty. Ask an incumbent's customer why they stay and listen carefully to the answer. If the answer centers on the person, trust in a specific account manager, familiarity with the team, the comfort of a named contact they have worked with for years, the market has a structural relationship dependency. The autonomous model cannot displace that preference regardless of operational superiority. The customer is not paying for efficiency. They are paying for presence. If the answer centers on the outcome, speed, cost, accuracy, reliability of a delivery, the market is serving a customer who would prefer logic but has not yet been given the option. That preference gap is the opportunity. The customer is articulating a frustration with the delivery model, not an attachment to it. They are paying for a relationship they do not particularly want because no credible alternative has been offered. That is an accidental feature of how the market has been served, not a structural requirement of what the customer needs. The discipline of market selection requires getting this distinction right before any engineering capital is committed. The signal is in the customer's language, not in the incumbent's cost structure. A human-heavy incumbent with high margin is evidence of operational arbitrage only when the customers value the outcome more than the relationship. When they value the relationship itself, the same market profile is a structural failure dressed as an opportunity. Arco's record is defined by the discipline of this rejection. Every market we have declined has had a feature that made it appear attractive: large revenue pools, slow incumbents, visible inefficiency, and a structural flaw that made the operational arbitrage unavailable, a regulatory barrier at the transaction level, a subjective judgment requirement, a low-frequency demand structure, or a genuine relationship dependency at the core of what the customer is paying for. Each rejection preserves the capital and the time that would otherwise be spent building into a market that the architecture cannot serve. The discipline is not strategic patience. It is structural honesty. Market selection is equally defined by what we reject as by what we pursue. Both decisions require the same precision. What is systemic resistance, and which markets does it disqualify for autonomous reconstruction? Systemic resistance is the structural condition of a market where legal, social, or creative requirements mandate human intervention, making autonomous operation impossible regardless of technical capability. Three forms disqualify a market permanently. Regulatory bottlenecks, where law requires a qualified human to execute each transaction in the core revenue loop. Subjective judgment, where the outcome cannot be defined in deterministic terms and the human is the product rather than an inefficiency. And low-frequency, high-variance demand, where the revenue loop executes too infrequently for the architecture to stabilize. The test in all three cases is whether the human-to-logic ratio has a permanent floor set by something external to the technology. If it does, the market has required inefficiency, not accidental inefficiency, and autonomous reconstruction cannot capture the operational arbitrage. Here is the verdict on market selection. Episode 5 defined the conditions that make a market worth entering: proven demand, a human-to-logic ratio above 60%, fragmented incumbents, low technological adoption, no regulatory barrier at the Tier 1 level. Those 5 conditions describe what an autonomous business can be built into. Episode 17 describes the conditions that disqualify a market, regardless of how large or active it appears: systemic resistance in its regulatory form, its subjective judgment form, and its low-frequency, high-variance form. And the false positive, markets that look reconstructable but are serving customers who value the relationship itself, not the outcome it delivers. What these failure conditions share is that none of them are resolvable by a better architecture. They are not technology problems waiting for the technology to improve. They are structural features of how markets are organized, features that the human-to-logic ratio reveals, that the selection process must test, and that the architecture cannot overcome regardless of how capable agents become. Some markets are not broken. They are simply human by design. Those markets belong to the incumbents who built them. The full written version of this argument is memo number 17, What Not to Build, on the blog at arcoventure.studio. The Arco lexicon at arcoventure.studio/lexicon defines systemic resistance, human-to-logic ratio, operational arbitrage, and every other term this episode has used. Next week, the human-to-logic ratio in full. the one metric that identifies breakable markets, how to calculate it, and what it reveals about an incumbent's structural vulnerability. Technology changes what is possible. Selection determines what is profitable. This has been episode 17 of the Operator Log.